Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Modern Data webinar series. We are in our third installment, and we've been talking over the last several weeks about how teams can accelerate their path from generating insights to reaching decisions in a series of conversations between Sisu and Mode. Today, our goal is to help you find ways to put your data to use faster, to inform better decisions, and ultimately accelerate your team's path towards a more data-driven decision culture, but also to advance our careers and look towards what is next in the future of analytics. Before we dig into the conversation today, which I'm very excited about, I do want to yet again point you towards some quick housekeeping about the webinar platform we are using today. We like to keep these conversations as interactive as possible, and you will have the opportunity to ask both Ben and Peter questions, participate in the conversation. If you are having any technical challenges with audio, screen sharing, or video, please put that into the chat section, and the team here will get that resolved as quickly as possible. If you have a question you would like to ask of our panelists today, the Q&A panel is the best way to do that. We will monitor those and inject those into the conversation as we go. All right, so let's dig into this. As I mentioned, this is the third episode in a four-part series. In the last installment, we sat down with a couple of practitioners, both from the data analytics side and the data science side, and we talked about the opportunities and the challenges of taking a more augmented and exploratory approach to analysis, and looked at this from both sides. But we talked about the challenge today. It feels like a lot of the analytics task. It feels a bit like the myth of Sisyphus, where you're constantly pushing a rock uphill. As soon as you get that question answered, it rolls back down on top of you and you're starting all over again. Today, we're going to carry that conversation a step forward and dig deeper into this idea and the opportunity for augmentation in our workflow. And so this week, and what I'm particularly excited to do is introduce everyone here to two founders and innovators in this space, Peter Bayless and Ben Stansel. What we're going to do in the conversation is dive deeper into this topic. We're going to first define what is augmented analytics. We're going to talk about what it is not and the problems that it is not suited well to change. And along the way, we're going to touch on why now is the time to start investing in these ideas for your team, and maybe how they can address some of the unique challenges that our enterprise data teams face. As I mentioned, we do want to make the conversation as interactive as possible. So while I have a couple of things to ask Ben and Peter to start with, please get those questions into the Q&A panel, and we will incorporate them as we go. So let's dig into this. To start, I do want to formally introduce you to our two speakers. So first up, we have Ben Stansel, who's the president and co-founder of Mode Analytics. You'll see him there in his sweater with the window behind him. Ben, how's it going this morning?
Good. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. And then joining Ben on this topic is Peter Bayless, the CEO and founder of Sisu. Peter, how are you doing today?
Really excited to be here. Thanks for hosting, Grant.
Absolutely. I'm glad to see both of you, and it's actually nice to see a little bit of reality as opposed to the Zoom backgrounds that we've had in the background. Though, if anybody wants to put a cat on your head, I say go for it. Everything is fair game. All right, well, to jump right into this, I think that one of the topics we started talking about last week with Kendall and Nate from your teams is this idea of augmented analytics, but I wanted to pose this to the two of you. Right, what in your minds, what is augmented analytics, and why is it suddenly rising to the top of everyone's conversation and priority list? Ben, can we start with you as you think about what does it mean to augment the analytics process?
Sure. So for a little background, I come from the perspective of this as an analyst or a data scientist who's responsible for answering questions to help businesses make better decisions. Like overwhelmingly, that is how we think of like the value of a lot of what data is for as companies or businesses. We need to make a bunch of decisions every day, and how do we help people do that? And what augmented analytics is to me is how do we accelerate the ability for people to be able to make a lot of those decisions by giving them like views into that data that they wouldn't be able to find themselves. That you have to go, the process of answering a question or better understanding how people are using a product or using your service or whatever it is involves investigating a lot of different things and kind of finding the interesting nuggets in a whole sea of different sort of potential things you could be digging through. And augmented analytics is about trying to point you in the right directions from the start. It's not about replacing you as an analyst or data scientist, but it's about giving you a lot of those clues and those kind of threads you can pull on, so that every kind of investigation that you do, whether or not it's answering a question or trying to uncover a problem or explain some phenomenon that's happening in the business that's unexpected, it's giving you a head start in all of that, so that you don't go through a lot of the kind of like drudgery of the 10 things you have to do before you answer every question, and kind of say, okay, I know there's something here to dig into, and I'm gonna follow this lead to see if there's something really there.
Got it. I think you use a good metaphor there, kind of like this sea of possibilities. I mean, Peter, from the jumping off point, that's a little bit of what your background in research is in prior to Sisu, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that one of the reasons why augmented analytics is so exciting right now is that if you look at the curves over time, the trends over time in terms of cost to store data and cost of processing, especially in the cloud, you're basically moving to a world where you've got nearly free data storage and nearly infinite compute, especially compared to where we were, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so a lot of our work back on campus at Stanford asked this question, if you don't need a faster database because you always pay more money to make your database run faster, how do you shift the bottleneck away from people, where your database can run queries infinitely fast, but how do you make it so people know what queries to actually go and run? Or when you can do a table scan faster than you can click a mouse, how do you make people use fewer mouse clicks, right? Basically trying to understand, how do you use compute and all of that data more effectively in order to remove that bottleneck, which is just basically people's ability to ask and answer the right questions. And not so much to replace someone, because that's a really hard thing to do, and we can dig into that during this hour, but really helping them do more of what they're really good at and less of what can be automated and can be sped up with database engineering and machine learning.
Yeah, I think that the we can get into this a little bit too, but the technology obviously is the underlying all this is really important. And I think that where I see augmented analytics really helping is the technology is to a point where computers basically can ask a whole bunch of relatively dumb questions really, really fast. And they're dumb in the sense that it's like basic, you're not sort of figuring out something terribly novel, but you're asking so many questions quickly that you can find which ones have interesting answers basically right away. And then as an analyst or a data scientist or as a human, you can then find the things that have interesting answers and say, I'm going to go focus on these things, as opposed to having to go through the manual and kind of rote process of asking all those questions yourself.
Right. And I think that part of the challenge today is the conventional model around OLAP querying and writing SQL, and then a lot of the UIs built on top of that, which are so manually driven. They make sense for a world where the database is the slow part of the equation, and you want to think really, really hard about what query you're going to run. But especially when you think about the investments in data infrastructure and digital transformation people are making, where they're pulling in more and more data sources into these databases, suddenly, kind of as you mentioned, Ben, you've got all of these questions you could go and ask, maybe individually, none of which are particularly interesting on their own, like same store sales this week versus last week by region, then same store sales this week versus last week by SKU, then same store sales this week. I mean, you can just I'm already getting bored, even going through the example, right? And I can go do that with every single column in my database. And yet maybe at some point, that's actually where the interesting kind of insight or the opportunity for the business lies. And so I think this idea that as compute's gotten cheaper, letting the machines go and ask those questions, which 99.9% of the time don't have an interesting answer. So you can find that, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000% chance that there is something there, that you'll go and find that, and kind of automating that rote and routine thing, which really doesn't scale, but can, if you use humans, but can scale when you throw compute at it.
Yeah, the OLAP cube is an interesting path to this, which basically that's the way we've tried to solve this before, is way back when it's hard to ask any question. Then we made it easy for humans to ask these sort of simple questions through things like OLAP cubes, but every single question required a human to basically tell the OLAP cube what to do. And now augmented analytics is basically at a massive scale, augmenting those sort of spelunking through the OLAP cube, as it were, to figure out what are the places that are interesting to look into.
Totally. And I love the idea of the cube in the sense that the actual, when we think about a cube, it's like 3-dimensional object. And everyone can visualize the cube in low dimensional space. But when you think about piping in all of your data from Salesforce and Marketo and Adobe Analytics and your product, data and your first party, whatever is in your transaction database and so on, and you're stitching all that together, and it's cheaper than ever to go and do those integrations. Like when you're talking n-dimensional space, like, you're in a hypercube, which is like, no one tries to visualize hypercubes, but then they expect everyone to basically build dashboards to explain them and what's going on. And you end up looking at these like really low dimensional projections through the cube and hoping that you find something, versus realizing that the actual process of navigating this cube, it's actually pretty hard. There's a lot of you got to be careful you're not finding false discoveries. You make sure you're finding true things that are moving the business, not just kind of spurious correlations or outliers. But yeah, I think that like navigating that cube, I think about like Johnny Mnemonic, like we're in the dataverse, we're zooming around. It's like, I want a car for the dataverse. I don't want to have to go walk through this thing, cell by cell.
That's kind of an amazing reference, Peter. That brought back so many flashbacks in a good way for me. But kind of going down that path, like, who is this for, right? I talk about like who benefits from this approach. Is this skipping towards, like just giving the business the answer to the questions automatically, or is this helping somebody else in the data pipeline process?
So my answer to this is it helps everybody. If this, if it all works, it helps everybody. That it helps the business not because the business suddenly has all the answers, but it helps because the analysts are able to answer questions more quickly or find the interesting things more quickly. And sort of analysts spend all of their time focused on in the Johnny Mnemonic example, spend all their time on like the interesting parts of that universe and not driving the car around trying to figure out where they should be actually spending their time. So that's good for them because it makes them more effective. It also, frankly, makes their jobs a lot more fun. That nobody particularly enjoys the sort of exploratory part of like, I'm going to go look at 50 things and 49 are going to turn out to be boring. Like you want to spend all your time on the one. It's more fun. It's the thing that you're excited about discovering. It's the thing that like gets people motivated. So a tool that just tells you here's the things to go look at is exciting. It's good for the business too, because it makes those people more effective and presumably helps them uncover things they wouldn't know otherwise. So not only does it help them find these things faster, but if it at the scale that we can start to do this now, it's that humans were going to look at 50 things and find one interesting thing. Now it's that the machines are going to look at 10,000 things and find 50 interesting things. And so we've actually got all of these different things we can explore that we wouldn't have been able to otherwise.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think everyone benefits, but I'd stop short of saying it's going to get you the one true answer, out of the gate. Like, I think that a lot of the narrative around this stuff tends to be, we're going to find, the unexpected, and we're going to blow your mind, and it's going to be this, brand new world that you're going to step into, where suddenly like you'll be told exactly what to go do in your business. And I think anyone who's spent time with the business knows that there's rarely the one weird trick to optimize the most important metrics like revenue, conversion, churn. It's pretty hard to run a business. And you go analytics and service and optimize these metrics. I like to think about it more as this has the opportunity to deliver the right nudges at the right time to help people make the most informed decisions that they can, knowing full well that even today, with all of the data that's present in a warehouse, it's going to be incomplete. I haven't met a single person who's modeled, in their database in a column, is there a global pandemic going on when this transaction was placed, right? It's like no one expected COVID to happen. But that said, stopping short of completely automating, say, the marketing department, or completely automating the sales ops department and so on, you can still go very, very far, because where you're starting from today without augmented analytics is people just staring at dashboards, and they can go and look and draw whatever conclusions they want from their metric going up or down or staying flat. But giving them that ability to drill in and essentially get the benefit of hours, if not days or weeks worth of time being spent by a machine going and looking and curating exactly new things they might have otherwise missed, or more context for that weekly business review where they're prepping for, that's a huge lift. And I think it's this kind of series of gradual steps that over time, as we've seen folks adopt this type of technology, it tends to be those wins week in, week out that build up that culture and that trust in decision making, as opposed to the one weird trick that Mary happened to pull out of her dashboard that saved the day 1 month. It's this discipline that gets built up, and I think that you see the business gets excited because they start to realize they're making better decisions. You get the analysts excited because they realize they don't have to spend much time digging in. You get the data scientists excited because they don't have to run a regression again.
Got it. And actually, responding to a live question that's coming in, you talked about the tools that can do this. I actually have a couple people asking, what are the tools that we're talking about here? Are there specific technologies that can do this augmentation of the hypothesis testing?
Don't know of any. I mean, so obviously, Sisu is one that can do this. There are other tools out there that follow these same patterns. I don't know if we want to get into this now. The augmented analytics is starting partly because it is, as you said, it's something that's popular right now, and that a lot of people are talking about. The definition of it is kind of expanded, or a lot of things are claiming to be that. There are certain things I would characterize as augmented analytics and things that I wouldn't, without getting into specific tools at the moment on what those things are. I think that to me, augmented analytics is exactly this. It's sort of like insight lead discovery in a lot of cases, as much as anything. If augmented analytics is not trying to basically, as Peter said, be the thing that tells you exactly what to do, that I think is a step further than we're actually capable of doing, or in a lot of cases is going to find you a lot of like false signals about things that aren't right. Like there should be humans in the loop of this. And I think that's one of the reasons that Sisu, I think, does this right, is it approaches it as, we want to surface some things to you. What you do with them is still the decision for you to make, but we want to surface these things to you. So that is, I mean, the sort of clear tool, I think, that is doing this well at the moment. Shameless plug.
We'll take it.
I said, Peter, do you want to build on that at all? Because the idea of like, is this a component of an existing platform, or is augmented analytics kind of a platform or a way to do analysis on its own?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. The analogy I would draw, and there's some flaws with this analogy, but I'm going to make it anyway. We can go into the flaws. Is you think about the 90s, trying to figure out what's going on in the internet. There was a great company called Netscape that basically built one of the first browsers. And the browser is still an enduring piece of technology that's super useful today for rendering anything you want to go and find on the web, right? And now there are mobile browsers, and still a strong product category. When I think about dashboards, I think of them as browsers. And where I think about augmented analytics fitting is on top of the world's private, predominantly structured data. It's essentially the equivalent of a search engine to tell you where you should go look. Google doesn't tell me where to go get breakfast, but it can tell me where places to get breakfast are around me, right? Super, super useful. Now, the interface to this, and the reason why it's a flawed analogy, I don't think the answer is natural language, right? It doesn't have to be typing in, where should I go get breakfast, or why did my SAOs drop? But the idea of some process that's running that is transparent to me, going and organizing all of the data that I might be interested in, that can go and tell me what is meaningful and relevant to me based on everything I've done recently, based on the latest piece of data that are available to me, and based on all the context about people who look like me. That's very, very similar to augmented analytics. And so when I think about this product category, of which Sisu is a big part of this, and I've certainly spent half a decade of my life working in this space, I see it from a technology perspective as fundamentally different than dashboarding and business intelligence as we're used to it today, which are predominantly focused on visualization, reporting, and to some extent exploration. And augmented analytics for me really is about ranking and relevance to help everyone who has access to this type of data understand what is most relevant to the decisions that they need to make today and tomorrow and for the foreseeable future, based on all the data that's available to them at any point in time.
So there's actually, I have a question about that, Peter. The search, I don't know that I agree with the search engine analogy. And for one, I think I agree with the natural language thing of like, it's not necessarily natural language. Like, and I think there's a lot of companies and products that try to tack on augmented analytics that make it sound like, hey, we have augmented analytics. Guess what it is? It's like a way to type natural language queries that we like transform into a SQL query and give you the wrong answer. That's not what augmented analytics is. I think we agree on that. The place where I don't know, but I agree with the search engine piece is, or this is a question I have for you is, do you see it as do you see it as a thing where people go looking for an answer and they are finding something? Like, is it discovery, or is it finding something that you are looking for? So is it the search interface in Spotify, or is it the Discover Weekly in Spotify, where there's a search-based idea of like, I know what I am looking for. I want to find a restaurant near me. Show me the 3 that are relevant and I'll choose the best one. Or is it just like, you know what I like, you know what I'm interested in, take that and show me what might be interesting tomorrow?
Totally. It's a great question. I think I'll stand by the search analogy in one regard, and I'll back away from another. So the one regard I feel pretty strongly about, and anyone who's tried these augmented analytics or insights or outlier detection or whatever you want to choose, your favorite cool vendor trying to sell you some cool technique about finding the unexpected in your data, that sort of thing, right? I think search engines, if you look back in 1997, 1998, there were a bunch of search engines. None of them worked very well. In fact, a lot of people still use, Yahoo, right? Just as a ink to me and so on.
Ask Jeeves was the clear best then.
Exactly. Certainly had the best, still have the best building in Oakland and the best butler to go and serve your queries. So like today, I don't know anyone who uses Bing on a regular basis, not because Microsoft hasn't poured billions of dollars into Bing, but just that Google has continuously invested in better and better search technologies. There's a cost associated with that, which is also why we have DuckDuckGo and why the federal government took the steps they took today. But in a nutshell, like Google is undisputedly the king of search results. Now they give you the best results. And if you can't find it on Google, it doesn't matter. I think today what you're seeing in augmented analytics from a vendor perspective is this bunch of people claiming to do a lot about finding unexpected hidden insights, all this stuff in their data. And I think that the way this plays out over the next 5 years is best result quality wins, where the results kind of speak for themselves. The ability to give the most relevant results to an individual user and to a business at each point in time is going to be the differentiator between success in this space and then kind of has been. So that's where I like the search metaphor. What I don't like about the search metaphor, which I think you totally hit the nail on the head, is that if I'm an analyst today, I'm probably responsible for tending to, if I'm embedded within a business unit, there's probably 5 or 6 metrics that executives in the business unit are going to go look at on a weekly basis. If I'm in the center of excellence, I'm probably curating metrics for a huge range of users within my company. It can be hundreds of metrics. But the key thing is the metrics that I care about, well, now there's 5 or 500, you don't change them that often. If I care about average revenue per user, or I care about average order value, or I care about churn, and that's a metric that is important to the business, that metric we define once a quarter, more likely once a year, and will always change. And so in contrast with someone going to ask exploratory questions, did revenue change? Did revenue change? Did revenue change? Why did it change? Why did it change? Why did it change? You're right that the value of an augmented analytics tool is actually freeing someone up from having to go and ask that question, interrogate their data every single week, week in, week out. And the augmented analytics tool to actually understand natively, guess what? Ben cares about revenue. Well, let's just register that as a query, and anything something changes about revenue, we'll go and tell him. And so in that sense, it's much more the Spotify weekly. It's the curated, here's some things that happened. In this case of Discover Weekly, it's here's some new music that got released. In the case of an augmented analytics system, it can be, here's what new changes happened in your data that may be interesting or relevant to your KPIs. And it's much more push-based. And I think that it's gotta be push-based just because there's too much changing inside of private data in terms of changes in the business, changes to customer purchasing behavior and so on, where it has to be a push-based model as opposed to this go and ask me a question. So I think that, and if you think of the impact on the business, no business user wants to go and ask 1,000 questions or BI tool, right? They just want to be told what's going on, right? They want to give it essentially on a silver platter. So, when I ordered, like how many people ordered delivery versus pickup? Like I think that augmented analytics is much more of a delivery mechanism versus a go pick up your insights approach.
Gotcha. So I'm going to maybe butcher this or take this analogy way too far. On the Spotify case, part of it is like, it needs to be personalized. Like it can't be, the outlier detection ends up being too much of a, hey, we're Spotify, this song is popular, we're going to send it to you. And it's like, I don't care about that. This is like, that's what outlier detection is. There needs to be more personalized, but it also needs to be something that isn't me asking for, show me the latest from X artist. And it also can't be something where I like go to my weekly digest. It's like, show me the things as they happen that I might be interested in. Like that's sort of the secret sauce of like a personalized push of something that I know that I'm going to be able to make some decision about, as opposed to either just like push if something's weird, take a look.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that what's like kind of baffling to me about this space, and one of the reasons why I personally got super excited about it, is that from a consumer setting, we expect everything to be personalized. I mean, there's like not a single media experience that I use today, whether or not it's my news, whether or not it's music, whether or not it's TikTok or YouTube or Netflix, where there's some degree of personalization that I'm getting a different view than you are. I don't think I can, in many cases, I can't even see your view even if I wanted to, right? It's completely isolated to a per user basis, where what's relevant to me is what's surfaced. And if you look at the kind of user interface model that a lot of these conventional analytics tools, present, it's entirely static. It's like I get the same view every single day, independent of whatever change in the data, or if there's a shift that's occurred that is not that may not be evident on my top of line dashboard. And then every user logging in the system also gets that same view. And there's a lot of reasons why this is harder to do in a B2B context. Like there's a lot fewer users per account than there are people clicking on ads on Google and listening to Spotify. But that's exactly kind of the opportunity is, can't we get at least a baby step towards personalization and better relevance on a personal basis, especially given what's at stake, which is literally businesses are running their business based on KPIs derived from their data. It's amazing, right? That's like an amazing shift that I'd say has only really occurred at scale in the last 5 years with all of the technology changes we've talked about. But it's just baffling to me that like the user interaction model still depends on like a static index to go and navigate and figure out what should I go look at. It's like the Yahoo Web Index all over again.
Let's not go back there. Actually, we're getting a couple questions on maybe an example or two of a company who's been able to do this effectively, get into the world of implementing augmented analytics as part of their day-to-day workflow.
I'm happy to take a stab at this. One of the companies we work very closely is Samsung. They're a large multinational electronics manufacturer. You may have heard of them. We spend time with a lot of time with their mobile team. So you got public case studies available, can point you towards them. But in a nutshell, they have an analyst team whose job is to help understand who's upgrading their handsets, right? When they do a new product launch, there's a ton of people who get in and think about, okay, what promotions are we running that are working well? How's this varying by carrier? What behavioral components trigger an upgrade and so on. This is a big deal for their business. The interesting thing when we started working with Samsung, that they had analyst teams who would kind of pore over the data about handset upgrades on a weekly basis and try to figure out, what was new and different that week. I mean, for a company that spends more than any other company on the planet on advertising, it's $1 billion a month. They were basically constantly trying to keep up with the business, things changing, going running analysis, come back. What we've done with Sisu is taken what's essentially a manual process for their weekly reporting and able to accelerate it such that the analysts spend less time manually slicing and dicing and can instead come to the weekly business review with the top 3 or 4 factors coming from Sisu automatically, where the analyst spends more time kind of telling the story and interpreting the data and essentially making recommendations about where to go in terms of the next week's activity during the product launch, as opposed to just spending their time, digging in, saying, oh, let me go check this factor and check that factor. The business asks, well, did you check carrier cross demographic? And they'll say, oh, no, we didn't do that. Let me go back and run that. So it's switched from basically this kind of reactionary, we've got the data, we got to go and respond to the business once they ask the questions, and we're constantly trying to play catch up, to one where they're able to come to the business using the data they already have and go and tell that story much more effectively. Not because we're doing anything they couldn't do on their own, but because it just wasn't cost effective at any scale, even with 1,000 analysts, to go and look at all of these different metrics.
Okay, great. And so building on this, there's a question that's come in actually carrying the Spotify example forward. And I think this is probably interesting. Ben, I know you've got a background in politics and audiences, and I think that this might be, in the current environment, something interesting. So the question is using the Spotify example, isn't it too easy to get into a vicious cycle where you're not exposed to new music, new ideas, more facts? Like, is this kind of recommendation reinforcing the bias as opposed to removing bias from the analytics process?
So certainly in like consumer apps and things like Spotify or, I mean, Facebook kind of famously, there is this potential. You can do things to correct for it, and I suspect Spotify does some of that, of trying to like step out of genres that you always listen to and things like that. I don't know how the Discover Weekly is actually generated. So I think the analogy breaks down a little bit here for the automated analytics case. I think that, and y'all are the ones who are focused more on solving this specifically. So I'm sure y'all have thought about this more than I have, but I think that the degree to which like you get sort of pigeonholed into a certain area of the business is something there's not that many things. The business is not, it's not the universe of sort of all the music in the world. It's a much narrower sort of universe to be focused on. Plus, if you get pulled into, if say you are a marketer and you suddenly find all of your recommendations being focused on product analytics, that's something you can kind of self-correct pretty easily. Whereas you can't really retrain your like Facebook algorithm in the same way. So I think that, there is some human intervention that is necessary in these sorts of systems. And as kind of Peter was saying, I think that is by design the way that these work, that these aren't entirely automated systems that will just learn from what you do without any kind of intervention from the people actually doing it. In order, the information you get out of an automated analytics system, you have to make some decision on. And so you actually have to take it and sort of explore it further. And so I think there's like a lot stronger signal there that kind of keeps you from being sort of pigeonholed into just getting a set of insights and having the tool bury the other ones that you may want to know. I don't think it's a smaller universe basically to deal with.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll just mention here too as well is, in so many cases that we work with analysts, right? And analysis is an inherently iterative process. And so, when you answer one question, 3 more pop up. And so I may find that a particular channel is outperforming all the other channels this week, and we had no idea what's behind this. I may want to drill in and just look at this channel. And then I actually realize, actually, it's not this channel. It has to do with something with this referrer, and then this firmographic information and so on. And I think when you keep the human in the loop in terms of, allowing people to essentially perform like what we call kind of low threshold, high ceiling. It's low threshold to get started. You can start to get value and understand, hey, what's going on? Tell me something I didn't already know, or tell me something I've overlooked, but then give them the ability to spend as much time drilling in, digging deeper, asking those follow-on questions. You essentially allow people to get out of these kind of local optima in some sense, or get out of the rut, or get out of these self-enforcing feedback loops. And I think the difference between something like a augmented analytics platform and Spotify is very restrictive in terms of what I can actually do in terms of providing feedback. Like, for example, I would love to have a dial on my Spotify where I could crank up in ML terms, there's this trade-off between exploration, which is finding new things, and exploitation, which is showing me stuff that I want. I actually have this problem with Spotify all the time. I feel like I get played the same stuff all of the time. And I wish there was a dial that said, hey, crank up my exploration, show me some stuff I have never listened to, or that might be a little bit of a wild card. And the difference between Spotify and augmented analytics platform is the augmented analytics platforms I'm aware of, they do provide those knobs. And they do provide the ability for power users to go and ask more questions and drill in and so on. It's not just thumbs up, save this to my library, or don't play this ever again. And that's like a really, really big delta where I think there's a big opportunity, even from a product design perspective, to make a big impact where you have a lot more technical expertise among the users of these augmented analytics platforms that you can benefit from by keeping them in the loop. But it looks a lot different than just thumbs up, thumbs down, which I think is a very coarse-grained rating system.
Okay, excellent. So I want to move us more towards conclusions now. We're about 40 minutes in. We have a couple polling questions for the audience. We'd love to hear from you on a couple of questions. Can we push that out now? And while that's going, I just think, summarizing this a little bit, what you're talking about, why do you see this step toward augmented analytics as a key investment for your customers and for companies overall?
Go ahead. So I think that there's, one of the questions you had earlier was like, why is this the thing that's happening now? There's kind of a macro trend there of like the technology is there to support it and those sorts of things. I think the sort of more micro trend is, and this is a micro trend as a part of the macro trend, is the uncertainty that you have to be able to, like, you have to deal with a ton of uncertainty today, particularly in this environment. You have to respond to that uncertainty really, really quickly. And the more time you're spending digging through hypotheses, sort of doing this stuff that Peter was describing that Samsung was doing, the less you're going to find and the less quickly you're going to find it. And so like the value of it is especially when you're trying to find a bunch of stuff that you're not familiar with, you're trying to operate in an environment that is something totally new. Having something that can kind of guide you through that process is hugely beneficial. To kind of continue on the Spotify example, suppose now like we're in a whole new world, and suppose like an entire genres of music have just been like released. You have to go understand what it is that you like from genres you've never heard of. You want to have a tool that kind of helps point you in the right direction to be able to explore that entire new genre. And that's kind of where we are today. So a big part of it is that I think it's like a valuable way to be able to kind of deal with this level of uncertainty, because the other kind of part of it is not biased by the conclusions that you already have in your head, that you may go into these sorts of moments of uncertainty already with a perspective of how the business runs, already thinking like I am basically tied to the way the world used to be. And so you're less good at asking these novel new questions. Whereas if you have something that can ask those at scale, it's not going to kind of, as Peter was saying, it's not going to bias itself to the local maximum that you already kind of live in, or the sort of previous assumptions that you have long lived in that you have a hard time even seeing past.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add to this is, if you look at the history of technology, people have always come up with new creative and clever ways to use more compute power. If you think about, in the early 90s, everyone thought, oh my gosh, this internet's like an amazing thing. Like it's, we're like, who knows what's going to happen with this. Fast forward, 20 years, I don't think anyone could have predicted, TikTok or Twitter or Facebook or the impact that all of these technologies can have on our lives. And I think from that perspective, when you think about what's happened inside of private enterprises and what happens when you adopt modern data warehousing technology and there's more data available than ever before, the expectations keep going up and up and up and up in terms of what to do with all that data. And we talked to, I was talking with a customer just last week who mentioned that they had increased the number of metrics that they were tracking in their data warehouse from, I think it was 200 to 500 over the last year, because more and more people want to understand at a finer and finer granularity what's going on in terms of their business. But there's no way that you can scale people to keep up with that increase in expectations, right? There's more data, people expect to do more with it, but you can't just hire more analysts to close that gap. And that's why I think from an analyst perspective, now is a time for augmented analytics, is that you've got to do more with more data using roughly the same number of people. And for me, that means we got to finally automate a lot of the boring parts of analysis, a lot of the rote, repetitive, tedious parts of that process, and have the people who are the most valuable part of the analytics ecosystem actually do what they're great at, which is formulate the right metrics to track, help translate the results to the business, and ultimately be the kind of creative data informed drivers of change in their organizations. And they get to be the heroes today more than ever, because you don't have to, the phrase, I don't know, we don't have data to support that, is really not one we hear that much anymore. It comes down to, I don't have time to go and answer that question. And if we can help people ask that question less and more often come to the table with results prepped and ready to go, that's just a huge unlock towards a train that's already moving, which is this move towards more and more data and more expectations around data.
Go ahead, there's an important thing I would add to that, which is agree, like as we collect more data and are able to sort of define more metrics essentially for your business, there is a huge danger of actually just defining more metrics for your business. Their business cannot run on 500 metrics. Like it will not be aligned. Nobody will know what they're talking about. Every department will look at a different thing. Nobody will be able to communicate. Like that's a disaster. But that doesn't mean there isn't signal in those 500 things. And so the value of something like augmented analytics is basically take that overhead away from you of everybody has some metric and say there is a system here that can identify when something in one of these things goes wrong, but we as a business can still be aligned around the core things that we need to focus on. So there's way too many analogies in this already, but to add it to another one, if you think about like a car, like Teslas are way more complicated than like a Camry from 30 years ago. But you can't put a dashboard on a Tesla that has every possible like diagnostic on it because you can't digest that. You still need to just know how fast is it going? Is it working? What's the battery level like? But you want a system that be able to identify the other diagnostics that are under the hood, literally, I guess, behind that car and just say, hey, here is something you should look at, and give me a fine-grained view of what that is if it goes wrong, but don't make me think about it all the time. I can't drive this car looking at 5,000 diagnostics all the time. And so augmented analytics gives you a way to actually be able to do that, to have the focus that you need on the certain things you're focused on, like day in and day out, while still surfacing the important information when those things come up.
Yep. No, I totally think that's, I completely agree. And the one thing I think is really amazing from an organizational perspective is you think about companies and how they behave, right? If to take the Tesla analogy, again, we love analogies. This is like really, we're going on analogy safari here. But
I have a whole blog post about why I think analogies are great for analysts. I have to defend it because I use way too many of them, but go ahead.
But okay, so to take the Tesla analogy, the crazy thing that I think is really fascinating is that typically as businesses, we only look at like the speedometer and the odometer. How far have we traveled? How fast are we going? But the reality is, inside of any moderately complex enterprise, you've got 20 people in a company, right? You've got someone who's in charge of the brakes, and someone who's in charge of the fuel injection, someone who's in charge of the turning, and so the idea that suddenly, I mean, it doesn't, you're right, no one person can consume 500 metrics, but the idea to get all 100 people each to be able to track the 5 metrics that matter to them, that's like the dream. But at the same time, there's no way that you can do that by hiring 500 analysts, one per person. And so it's almost, how do I get the right information, the right people at the right times, right? Really limiting and narrowing that information such that I go beyond just the speedometer, but I can optimize every piece of the car as it's moving, as it's in flight. And I think just from a sheer, I mean, even at like the largest companies in the world, which is where we started working, folks like Facebook and Google sponsoring our research at Stanford, even in like AdWords, you don't have one analyst per major account paying money on their AdWords products. So in fact, that's like the #1 product of all time and all of tech in terms of revenue. So I think that's kind of the opportunity is, how do you give everyone their own personal speedometer and odometer, such that at the end of the day, when you wire up the entire org structure of a modern company, everyone knows where they're going, how their actions are impacting their part of the business, and then how all of things ladder up into the final, top of line metrics that dictate, the speed and velocity of the company. And that's what's really exciting for me. And that's what doing more with more data really means. It's getting that both these pieces working super, super efficiently, then also laddering up to a better organizational outcome. And from an analyst perspective, I think the opportunity is by being a driver of change and showing what can be done with data, you can really percolate that change throughout the entire business, because you're not going to percolate it by hiring more people or having more colleagues in analytics. You're going to do it by essentially automating the parts that you can't scale.
Awesome. I think just summarizing some of this as we work towards the close here, I think more analogies is good. I think we should try to pair every KPI with an analogy at this point as we go. I do have one more question for you, but I think some interesting things coming from the poll. We shared them briefly, but at least on the session today, there they are for everyone. It seems like there is still, even though most of the attendees today have at close to 100% of their data in the cloud, of their data warehouse, they're still only able to get to averaging a little bit here, 2/3 or less of the data to drive analysis. And I think that speaks a little bit to the complexity and scope that we're talking about. But it also seems like people are spending a lot of time in this diagnosis space. I think, was that almost 90% of the attendees said it would save them multiple hours a week and potentially multiple hours a day with this kind of technology. So to close us out, I'm going to cherry pick a question from the audience here, which is, all right, this sounds great, but what advice would you give to an analyst, maybe even earlier on in their career, in terms of both learning and using some of these tools and techniques, but also justifying their utilization in the organization, right? How can I champion this for my team?
I think for me, this one of the biggest patterns of success that I see in organizations adopting augmented analytics is being able to identify the big, intense, most important business trends that are going on, whether it's something to do with, recovery during COVID, as Ben alluded to, maybe it's something about a new product launch going on, and being able to be the person in the room who can not only answer the question, why is this metric changing, when there's an unexpected dip or a spike or it's flat. Why aren't we growing more? Being able to, first of all, come to that answer and get that answer in hours as opposed to days or weeks, that tends to be a proof point where it really builds confidence with executives, with members of the business, where I say, holy cow, how did you come back to that so quickly? But then over time, what we've seen beyond these initial compelling events where, wow, you're able to, save the day with data or come with that deep understanding of the dynamics behind, key business event. Being able to repeatedly and recurring every week or every month during the business reviews that you're supporting, or during the reporting season that you're normally just showing up with a stack of charts, and actually able to come in with a very informed perspective on what is actually going on, what are the key dynamics and drivers behind the business, and almost switching from that model where you're being asked what to go dig into to one where you're able to come with confidence to be able to actually say, here's what's new and different, and here's an opportunity for the business, and really driving change with data as opposed to letting yourself be driven by the business. That's a big shift. Now, how you actually go out doing that, especially early career, and the first step is just, literally getting started with one of the many platforms in this space to go and see, what is actually possible given the types of data that are available inside of your organization. And then, starting small, but taking a big swing on a really important, business event where, from all the conversations you're hearing in your business, from all the conversations you're hearing in response to the reports, the questions you're being asked, where are some of the biggest opportunities to make a dent in the business, to change and nudge the direction of the company based on the data that you have, that with the right tooling, you can certainly do more of, looking at not just 50, 60, 70% of it, but all of it every single day, every single week, and really building up that confidence in what is now possible with the investments that your company's already made in terms of their data infrastructure.
Yeah, I would add sort of two things, and sort of parallel point perhaps on that last part. One, if you're just getting into it and just getting into analytics or data science, my general recommendation for folks is focus on the business and asking analytical questions and understanding what it is that people want to understand, not the technology. The technology is the easy part. Like, you'll learn the technology. The thing that makes people really great at being analysts and data scientists is they're able to apply that technology to a business problem in a meaningful way. Somebody who's, people who've written, I would rather work with someone who asks great questions and can Stack Overflow their way to answers than the person who wrote some Python package but doesn't know how to apply it to the business. So one, I would say focus on that. For the augmented analytics piece, one of the things that when people are trying to get executives on board with data generally, one of the things I've seen work pretty well is data teams that try to focus on just sharing what amounts to facts about the business with execs that they think are relevant to what it is they're trying to do. They may be things everybody's always assumed. They may be things that seem boring, but nobody looks at a bunch of charts and think like, great, I don't need to know that. Don't tell me more. Like, if you go to execs and say, hey, look, it turns out that we're a B2B SaaS company. We only have 30% of our users are using it on weekends. Like, obviously that's true, but if everybody just assumed it was less on weekends and now they know it's 30%, people might start asking questions. They might ask questions of like, do we see the same thing on holidays, or are there different countries where that's different? Like that, just showing sort of fact finding can be something that can actually lead people to ask a lot more questions and start turn to you for more answers. And this is a place where I think augmented analytics helps a ton, which augmented analytics job is to basically to find you interesting facts. Like, it sort of does your job for you, that says, hey, here's a bunch of interesting things that we can present to the business. Nobody's going to turn away from that. Nobody's going to say like, that seems like a curious thing that I wouldn't have expected. Thanks, go back to your office. Like, they're going to keep asking you more questions about it. And that's how you get in the room, is you have people who are curious about these things, who want to know more and see you as the path to getting that answer.
Okay. Awesome. Actually, I don't know if this was intentional, but you're setting up our next conversation fantastically. So as we wrap up today, first, Ben and Peter, thank you so much. I think this has been a great conversation. We definitely didn't cover everything we wanted to cover, but we also covered some ground that I think was more interesting. So that I really appreciate the candor and the willingness to disagree on a couple points, which was great. For those of you who are closing out with us, please join us for the next episode, which will directly go into what Ben and Peter were speaking about at the end, which is, as an analyst, as a data expert, how can I partner better with the business team? And to facilitate that conversation, we're actually bringing in two, I think, data savvy, data curious business leaders who are the consumer of these facts and these insights, for their point of view on how they think about data, what kinds of insights are useful to them, and how they would like to interact with the data team. Should be some great insights into how to move your career forward in this as well. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your morning and your afternoon, and stay safe out there.
Thanks, everyone.
Right,
Really
thanks, y'all.
enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah.